What? It's true. Uh, uh, uh. What? It's true.
You asleep?
Uh, uh.
Say so, and I'll go off in those hills. I've been mean, ain't I?
What?
If you don't want
It's
me, I
true.
can go off in the hills and find a cave. I can go away any time. No. Look, I was just fooling, Lenny. 'Cause I want you to stay with me. Trouble with mice is you always kill 'em. He paused. Tell you what I'll do, Lenny. First chance I get, I'll give you a pup. Maybe you wouldn't kill it. That'd be better than mice. And you could pet it harder. Lenny avoided the bait. He'd sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just gotta say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there. Right up in those hills and live by myself. And I won't get no mice stole from me. George said, I want you to stay with me, Lenny. Jesus Christ, somebody'd shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. Your Aunt Clara wouldn't like you running off by yourself, even if she is dead. Lenny spoke craftily. Tell me, like you done before. Tell you what? About the rabbits, George snapped. You ain't gonna put nothing over on me. Then he pleaded, Come on, George, tell me. Please, George, like you done before. You get a kick out of that, don't you? All right, I'll tell you, and then we'll eat our supper. George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically, as though he'd said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town and blow their stake, and the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. Lenny was delighted. That's it. That's it. Now, tell how it is with us. George went on. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about. He repeated his words rhythmically, as though he'd said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family, they don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town. About us. We don't have to sit in no bar room blowing in our jack just because we got no place else to go.
Jordan, look at my stream. Johnny, look. What the fuck? Johnny, look at my stream. I'm studying right now. I'm listening to the audiobook while playing. I'm gonna go in the other VC. You can join if you want.
If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for all anybody gives a damn, but not us. Lenny broke in. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me. We don't have to look after you, and that's why. He laughed delightedly. Go on now, George. You got it by heart. You can do it yourself. No, you. I forget some of the things. Tell about how it's going to be. Okay. Someday, we're going to get the jack together, and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted. And have rabbits. Go on, George. Tell about what we're going to have in the garden, and about the rabbits in the cages, and about the rain in the winter, and the stove, and how thick the cream is on the milk like you can hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. Why don't you do it yourself? You know all of it. No, you tell it. It ain't the same if I tell it. Go on, George. How I get to tend the rabbits. Well, said George, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens. And when it rains in the winter, we'll just say the hell with going to work, and we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around it and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. He took out his pocket knife. I ain't got time for no more. He drove his knife through the top of one of the bean cans, sawed out the top, and passed the can to Lenny. Then he opened a second can. From his side pocket he brought out 2 spoons and passed one of them to Lenny. They sat by the fire and filled their mouths with beans and chewed mightily. A few beans slipped out of the side of Lenny's mouth. George gestured with his spoon. What you gonna say tomorrow when the boss asks you a question? Lenny stopped chewing and swallowed. His face was concentrated. I ain't gonna say a word. Good boy. That's fine, Lenny. Maybe you're getting better. When we get the couple of acres, I can let you tend the rabbits, all right? Especially if you remember as good as that. Lenny choked with pride. I can remember, he said. George motioned with his spoon again. Look, Lenny, I want you to look around here. You can remember this place, can't you? The ranch is about a quarter mile up that way. Just follow the river? Sure, said Lenny. I can remember this. Didn't I remember about not going to say a word? Of course you did. Well, look, Lenny, if you just happen to get in trouble like you always done before, I want you to come right here and hide in the brush. Hide in the brush, said Lenny slowly. Hide in the brush till I come for you. Can you remember that? Sure I can, George. Hide in the brush till you come. But you ain't gonna get in no trouble, because if you do, I won't let you tend the rabbits. He threw his empty bean can off into the brush. "I won't get in no trouble, George. I ain't gonna say a word." "Okay. Bring your bindle over here by the fire. It's gonna be nice sleeping here, looking up in the leaves. Don't build up no more fire. We'll let her die down." They made their beds on the sand, and as the blaze dropped from the fire, the sphere of light grew smaller. The curling branches disappeared, and only a faint glimmer showed where the tree trunks were. From the darkness, Lenny called, "George, you asleep?" "No. What do you want?" "Let's have different color rabbits, George." "Sure we will," George said sleepily. "Red and blue and green rabbits, Lenny. Millions of them. Furry ones, George. Like I seen in the fair in Sacramento." "Sure. Furry ones. 'Cause I can just as well go away, George, and live in a cave." "You can just as well go to hell," said George. "Shut up now." The red light dimmed on the coals. Up the hill from the river a coyote yammered, and a dog answered from the other side of the stream. The sycamore leaves whispered in a little night breeze. The bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls there were small square windows, and in the 4th a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves and little vials, combs, and from nails on the box sides a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast-iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised. The door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans, and he carried a big push-broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round, stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell is this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. What the hell kind of bed you giving us anyway? We don't want no pants rabbits." The old swamper lifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what," he said finally, "last guy that had this bed was the blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella, and as clean a guy as you'll want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "Then how come he got graybacks?" George was working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," said the old swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals, he'd peel his boiled potatoes, and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was. Clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even. And then sit in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What'd you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, he just quit, the way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, give him my time one night, the way any guy would." George lifted his tick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately Lenny got up and did the same with his bed. Finally George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, "I guess the boss will be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eating breakfast and says, 'Where the hell's them new men?' And he gave the stable buck hell, too." George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. "Give the stable buck hell?" he asked. "Sure. You see, the stable buck's a nigger." "Nigger, huh?" "Yeah. Nice fella, too. Got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss gives him hell when he's mad, but the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room." "What kind of guy is the boss?" George asked. "Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, I guess. Know what he done Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right in here and says, 'Drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year.' The hell he did. Whole gallon? Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let the nigger come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after the nigger. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got him. If he could have used his feet, Smitty says he would have killed the nigger. The guy said on account of the nigger's got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet." He paused in relish of the memory. "After that, the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more." Lenny was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again, and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt on each side of a square steel buckle. The wooden latch raised again, and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he wasn't a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. "Them guys just come," he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. "I wrote Murray and Reddy. I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips?" George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. "It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning." George looked down at his feet. "Bus driver gave us a bum steer," he said. "We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning." The boss squinted his eyes. "Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now until after dinner." He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Letty nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. "What's your name?" "George Milton." "And what's yours?" George said, "His name's Lenny Small." The names were entered in the book. "Let's see. This is the 20th. Noon the 20th. He closed the book. "Where you boys been working?" "Up around Weed," said George. "You too?" To Lenny. "Yeah, him too," said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. "He ain't much of a talker, is he?" "No, he ain't. But he's sure a hell of a good worker. Strong as a bull." Then he smiled to himself. "Strong as a bull," he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, "Listen, Small." Lenny raised his head. "What can you do?" In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. "He can do anything you tell him," said George. "He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive a cultivator. He can do anything, just give him a try." The boss turned on George. "Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to put over?" George broke in loudly. "Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale." The boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted one eye nearly closed. "Say, what you selling?" "Huh?" "I said, what stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay away from him?" "No, of course I ain't." "Why you think I'm selling him out?" "Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I'd just like to know what your interest is." George said, "He's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right, just ain't bright. But he can do anything you tell him." The boss turned half away. "Well, God knows he don't need any brains to buck barley bags. But don't you try to put nothing over, Milton. I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit and weed?" "Job was done," said George promptly. "What kind of job?" We was digging a cesspool." "All right. But don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team." "Slim?" "Yeah. Big, tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner." He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went out, he turned and looked for a long moment at the 2 men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. so you wasn't gonna say a word. You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking. Damn near lost us the job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I gotta talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we gotta be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing, listening? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute, scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you was saying. A guy on a ranch don't never listen, nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and sit down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed all right. He's a nice fella, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him right. At that moment, a young man came into the bunkhouse. A thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. Seen my old man? He asked. The swamper said, He was here just a minute ago, Curly. He went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new man, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George, and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows, and his hands closed into fists. He stared at George, and he stopped. Curly. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new man and boots. Seen my old man? He asked. The swamper said, He was here just a minute ago, Curly. He went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new man, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George, and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows, and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George said, suppose he don't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he's got to talk when he's spoken to. What the hell you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. George watched him out, and then he turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight, and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. He don't have to take after Lenny. Lenny didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what, Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at him because he ain't a big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy? Sure, said George. I've seen plenty tough little guys. But this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't handy, but this Curly punk is going to get hurt if he messes around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy and licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick somebody his own size, and maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lenny. Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'd slew me. He just don't give a damn. Won't ever get canned because his old man's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me. I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me like he's worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple of weeks ago. Wife lives over in the boss's house. Seems like Curly is cockier than ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's showing off for his wife. The swamper warmed to his gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah, I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? What the hell for? Well, I'll tell you what. Curly says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. George studied the cards absorbedly. That's a dirty thing to tell around, he said. The old man was reassured. He'd drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and he spoke more confidently. Wait till you see Curly's wife. George cut the cards again and put out a solitaire lay, slowly and deliberately. Purty? He asked casually. Yeah, purty. But... George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah? Married 2 weeks and got the eye? Maybe that's why Curly's pants is full of ants. I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerk-line skinner, hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on a grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly never seen it, and I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like we was going to have fun. The swamper stood up from his box. Know what I think? George didn't answer. Well, I think Curly's married a tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty done that.
This ends Disc 1 of Mice and Men. Disc 2.
Slim the eye. Curly never seen it, and I seen her a hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to. The old man moved toward the door, and his ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta be setting out the wash basins for the guys. The teams will be in before long. You guys gonna buck barley? Yeah. You won't tell Curly nothing I said. Hell no. Well, you look her over, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out the door into the brilliant sunshine. George laid down his cards thoughtfully, turned his piles of 3. He built 4 clubs on his ace pile. The sun square was on the floor now, and the flies whipped through it like sparks. A sound of jingling harness and the croak of heavy-laden axles sounded from outside. From the distance came a clear call. Stable Buck! Oh, Stable Buck! And then, where the hell is that goddamn nigger? George stared at his solitaire lay, and then he flounced the cards together and turned around to Lenny. Lenny was lying down on the bunk watching him. Look, Lenny, this here ain't no setup. I'm scared. You gonna have trouble with that Curly guy. I've seen that kind before. He was kind of feeling you out. He figures he's got you scared, and he's gonna take a sock at you the first chance he gets. Lenny's eyes were frightened. I don't want no trouble, he said plaintively. Don't let him sock me, George. George got up and went over to Lenny's bunk and sat down on it. I hate that kind of bastard, he said. I've seen plenty of 'em. Like the old guy says, Curly don't take no chances. He always wins. He thought for a moment. If he tangles with you, Lenny, we're going to get the can. Don't make no mistake about that. He's the boss's son. Look, Lenny, you try to keep away from him, will you? Don't never speak to him. If he comes in here, you move clear to the other side of the room. Will you do that, Lenny? I don't want no trouble, Lenny mourned. I never done nothing to him. Well, that won't do you no good if Curly wants to plug himself up for a fighter. Just don't have nothing to do with him. Will you remember? Sure, George. I ain't gonna say a word. The sound of the approaching grain teams was louder, Thud of big hooves on hard ground, drag of brakes, and the jingle of trace chains. Men were calling back and forth from the teams. George, sitting on the bunk beside Lenny, frowned as he thought. Lenny asked timidly, "You ain't mad, George?" "I ain't mad at you. I'm mad at this here Curly bastard. I hoped we was going to get a little stake together, maybe $100. His tone grew decisive. "You keep away from Curly, Lenny." "Sure I will, George. I won't say a word. Don't let him pull you in. But if the son of a bitch socks you, let him have it." "Let him have what, George?" Never mind. Never mind. I'll tell you when. I hate that kind of a guy. Look, Lenny, if you get in any kind of trouble, you remember what I told you to do." Lenny raised up on his elbow, his face contorted with thought. Then his eyes moved sadly to George's face. "If I get in any trouble, you ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits." "That's not what I meant. You remember where we slept last night? Down by the river?" "Yeah, I remember." "Oh, sure I remember. I go there and hide in the brush. Hide till I come for you. Don't let nobody see you. Hide in the brush by the river." Say that over. "Hide in the brush by the river. Down in the brush by the river. If you get in trouble." "If I get in trouble." A brake screeched outside. A call came. "Stable, Buck! Oh, stable, Buck!" George said, "Say it over to yourself, Lenny, so you won't forget it." Both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips and wide-spaced eyes, heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. "I'm looking for Curly," she said. Her voice had a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her and then back. "He was in here a minute ago, but he went." "Oh." She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the doorframe so that her body was thrown forward. "You're the new fellas that just come, ain't you?" "Yeah." Lenny's eyes moved down over her body, and though she didn't seem to be looking at Lenny, she bridled a little. She looked at her fingernails. "Sometimes Curly's in here," she explained. George said brusquely, "Well, he ain't now." "If he ain't, I guess I better look someplace else," she said playfully. Lenny watched her, fascinated. George said, "If I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him." She smiled archly and twitched her body. "Nobody can't blame a person for looking," she said. There were footsteps behind her going by. She turned her head. "Hi, Slim," she said. Slim's voice came through the door. "Hi, good looking." "I'm trying to find Curly, Slim." "Well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going in your house." She was suddenly apprehensive. "Bye, boys," she called into the bunkhouse, and she hurried away. George looked around at Lenny. "Jesus, what a tramp," he said. "So that's what Curly picks for a wife." "She's purty," said Lenny defensively. "Yeah, and she's sure hiding it. Curly got his work ahead of him. Bet she'd clear out for $20. Lenny still stared at the doorway where she'd been. Gosh, she was purty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by an ear and shook him. "Listen to me, you crazy bastard," he said fiercely. "Don't you even take a look at that bitch. I don't care what she says and what she does. I seen 'em poison before, but I never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be." Lenny tried to disengage his ear. "Well, I never done nothing, George." "No, you never. But when she was standing in the doorway showing her legs, you wasn't looking the other way, neither." "Well, I never meant no harm, George. Honest, I never." "Well, you keep away from her, 'cause she's a rat trap if I ever seen one. You let Curly take the rap. He let himself in for it." "Glove full of Vaseline," George said disgustedly. "And I bet he's eating raw eggs and writing to the patent medicine houses." Lenny cried out suddenly. I don't like this place, George. This ain't no good place. I want to get out of here." "We gotta keep it till we get a stake." "We can't help it, Lenny. We'll get out just as soon as we can. I don't like it no better than you do." He went back to the table and set out a new solitaire hand. "No, I don't like it," he said. "For 2 bits I'd shove out of here. If we can get just a few dollars in the poke, we'll shove off. Go up the American River and pan gold. We can make maybe a couple of dollars a day there, and we might hit a pocket." Lenny leaned eagerly toward him. "Let's go, George. Let's get out of here. It's mean here." "We gotta stay," George said shortly. "Shut up now. The guys will be coming in." From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. "Maybe we ought to wash up," he said. "But we ain't done nothing to get dirty." A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm while he combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he'd finished combing his hair, he moved into the room, and he moved with a majesty only it studied the cards. "Maybe we ought to wash up," he said. "But we ain't done nothing to get dirty." And rattling basins shortly. "Shut up now. The guys will be coming in." From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. "Maybe we ought to wash up," he said. "But we ain't done nothing to get dirty." A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm while he combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he'd finished combing his hair, he moved into the room, and he moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. He was a jerkline skinner, the prince of the ranch, capable of driving 10, 16, even 20 mules with a single line to the leaders. He was capable of killing a fly on the wheeler's butt with a bullwhip without touching the mule. There was a gravity in his manner and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. This was Slim, the jerkline skinner. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or 50. His ear heard more than was said to him, and his slow speech had overtones not of thought, but of understanding beyond thought. His hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their actions as those of a temple dancer. He smoothed out his crushed hat, creased it in the middle, and put it on. He looked kindly at the two in the bunkhouse. "It's brighter than a bitch outside," he said gently. "Can't hardly see nothing in here. You the new guy?" "Just come," said George. "Gonna buck barley?" "That's what the boss says." Slim sat down on a box across the table from George. He studied the solitaire hand that was upside down to him. "Hope you get on my team," he said. His voice was very gentle. "I got a pair of punks on my team that don't know a barley bag from a blue ball. You guys ever bucked any barley?" "Hell yes," said George. "I ain't nothing to scream about, but that big bastard there can put up more grain alone than most pairs can." Lenny, who had been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacently at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over the table and snapped the corner of a loose card. "You guys travel around together?" His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. "Sure," said George. "We kind of look after each other." He indicated Lenny with his thumb. "He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I've knew him for a long time." Slim looked through George and beyond him. "Ain't many guys travel around together," he mused. "I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other." "It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know," said George. A powerful, big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped water from the scrubbing and dousing. "Hi, Slim," he said, then stopped and stared at George and Lenny. "These guys just come," said Slim by way of introduction. "Glad to meet you," the big man said. "My name's Carlson." "I'm George Milton. This here's Lenny Small." "Glad to meet you." Then stopped. Big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped water from the scrubbing and dousing. "Hi, Slim," he said, then stopped and stared at George and Lenny. "These guys just come," said Slim by way of introduction. "Glad to meet you," the big man said. "My name's Carlson." "I'm George Milton. This here's Lenny Small." "Glad to meet you," Carlson said again. "He ain't very small." He chuckled softly at his joke. "Ain't small at all," he repeated. "I meant to ask you, Slim, how's your bitch? I seen she wasn't under your wagon this morning." "She slang her pups last night," said Slim. 9 of them. "Carlson. These guys just come," said Slim by way of introduction. "Glad to meet," he said. A powerful, big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped water from the scrubbing and dousing. "Hi, Slim," he said, then stopped and stared at George and Lenny. "These guys just come," said Slim by way of introduction. "Glad to meet you," the big man said. "My name's Carlson." "I'm George Milton. This here's Lenny Small." "Glad to meet you," Carlson said again. "He ain't very small." He chuckled softly at his joke. "Ain't small at all," he repeated. "I meant to ask you, Slim, how's your bitch? I seen she wasn't under your wagon this morning." "She slang her pups last night," said Slim. 9 of them. "I drowned 4 of them right off. She couldn't feed that many." "Got 5 left, huh?" "Yeah, 5. I kept the biggest." "What kind of dogs do you think they're gonna be?" "I don't know," said Slim. "Some kind of shepherds, I guess. That's the most kind I seen around here when she was in heat." Carlson went on. "Got 5 pups, huh? Gonna keep all of them?" "I don't know. Have to keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk." Carlson said thoughtfully, "Well, look here, Slim. I've been thinking. That dog of Candy's is so goddamn old he can't hardly walk. Stinks like hell, too. Every time he comes into the bunkhouse, I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, damn near blind, can't eat. Candy feeds him milk. He can't chew nothing else. George had been staring intently at Slim. Suddenly, a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. "There she goes," said Carlson. Outside there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. "Hey, you guys better come on while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple of minutes." Carlson stepped back to let Slim precede him, and then the two of them went out the door. Lenny was watching George excitedly. George rumpled his cards into a messy pile. "Yeah," George said. "I heard him, Lenny. I'll ask you." "A brown and white one," Lenny cried excitedly. "Come on, let's get dinner." "I don't know whether he got a brown and white one." Lenny didn't move from his bunk. "You ask him right away, George, so he won't kill no more of them." As it had started, slowly at first, and then a dog a mile away. Also, they got 5 pups, huh? Gonna keep all of them? I don't know. Have to keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk. Carlson said thoughtfully, "Well, look here, Slim. I've been thinking. That dog of Candy's is so goddamn old he can't hardly walk. Stinks like hell, too. Every time he comes into the bunkhouse, I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, damn near blind, can't eat. Candy feeds him milk. He can't chew nothing else." George had been staring intently at Slim. Suddenly, a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. "There she goes," said Carlson. Outside there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. "Hey, you guys better come on while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple of minutes." Carlson stepped back to let Slim precede him, and then the two of them went out the door. Lenny was watching George excitedly. George rumpled his cards into a messy pile. "Yeah," George said. "I heard him, Lenny. I'll ask you." "A brown and white one," Lenny cried excitedly. "Come on, let's get dinner." I don't know whether he got a brown and white one. Lenny didn't move from his bunk. "You ask him right away, George, so he won't kill no more of them." "Sure. Come on now, get up on your feet." Lenny rolled off his bunk and stood up, and the two of them started for the door. Just as they reached it, Curly bounced in. "You seen a girl around here?" he demanded angrily. George said coldly. "About half an hour ago, maybe." "Well, what the hell was she doing?" George stood still, watching the angry little man. He said insultingly, "She said she was looking for you." Curly seemed really to see George for the first time. His eyes flashed over George, took in his height, measured his reach, looked at his trim middle. "Well, which way'd she go?" he demanded at last. "I don't know," said George. "I didn't watch her go." Curly scowled at him and, turning, hurried out the door. George said, "You know, Lenny, I'm scared I'm going to tangle with that bastard myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ." Come on, there won't be a damn thing left to eat. They went out the door. The sunshine lay in a thin line under the window. From a distance there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment, the ancient dog walked lamely in through the open door. He gazed about with mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed and then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curly popped into the doorway again and stood looking into the room. The dog raised his head. But when Curly jerked and lay in a thin line under the window, from a distance there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment, the ancient dog walked lamely in through the open door. He gazed about with mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed and then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curly popped into the doorway again and stood looking into the room. The dog raised his head. But when Curly jerked out, the grizzled head sank to the floor again. Although there was evening brightness showing through the windows of the bunkhouse, inside it was dusk. Through the open door came the thuds and occasional clangs of a horseshoe game, and now and then the sound of voices raised in approval or derision. Slim and George came into the darkening bunkhouse together. Slim reached up over the card table and turned on the tin-shaded electric light, and sank to the floor again. Although there was evening brightness showing through the windows of the bunkhouse, inside it was dusk. Through the open door came the thuds and occasional clangs of a horseshoe game, and now and then the sound of voices raised in approval or derision. Slim and George came into the darkening bunkhouse together. Slim reached up over the card table and turned on the tin-shaded electric light. Instantly the table was brilliant with light, and the cone of the shade threw its brightness straight downward, leaving the corners of the bunkhouse still in dusk. Slim sat down on a box, lying to the darkening bunkhouse together, and now and then the sound of voices raised in approval of a horseshoe game, and now Slim and George came into the darkening bunkhouse together. Slim reached up over the card table and turned on the tin-shaded electric light. Instantly the table was brilliant with light, and the cone of the shade threw its brightness straight downward, leaving the corners of the bunkhouse still in dusk. Slim sat down on a box, and George took his place opposite. "It wasn't nothing," said Slim. "I would have had to drown most of 'em anyway. No need to thank me about that." George said, "It wasn't much to you, maybe, but it was a hell of a lot to him. Jesus Christ, I don't know how we're going to get him to sleep in here. He'll want to sleep right out in the barn with him. We'll have trouble keeping him from getting right in a box with them pups." "It wasn't nothing," Slim repeated. "Say, you sure was right about him. Maybe he ain't bright, but I never seen such a worker. He damn near killed his partner, Bucking Barley. There ain't nobody can keep up with him. God almighty, I never seen such a strong guy." George spoke proudly. "Just tell Lenny what to do, and he'll do it if it don't take no figuring. He can't think of nothing to do himself, but he sure can take orders." There was a clang of horseshoe on iron stake outside, and a little cheer of voices. Slim moved back slightly so the light wasn't on his face. "Funny how you and him string along together." It was Slim's calm invitation to confidence. "What's funny about it?" George demanded defensively. "Oh, I don't know. Hardly none of the guys ever travel together. I hardly never seen two guys travel together. You know how the hands are. They just come in, get their bunk, and work a month, and then they quit and go out alone. Never seem to give a damn about nobody. It just kind of seems funny. A cuckoo like him and a smart little guy like you traveling together." "He ain't no cuckoo," said George. "He's dumb as hell, but he ain't crazy. And I ain't so bright neither. or I wouldn't be bucking barley for my 50 and found. If I was bright, if I was even a little bit smart, I'd have my own little place and I'd be bringing in my own crops instead of doing all the work and not getting what comes up out of the ground. George fell silent. He wanted to talk. Slim neither encouraged nor discouraged him. He just sat back, quiet and receptive. "It ain't so funny, him and me going round together," George said at last. "Him and me was both born in Auburn. I knowed his Aunt Clara. She took him when he was a baby and raised him up. When his Aunt Clara died, then he just come along with me out working. Got kind of used to each other after a little while." Said Slim. George looked over at Slim and saw the calm, godlike eyes fastened on him. "Funny," said George. "I used to have a hell of a lot of fun with him. Used to play jokes on him because he was too dumb to take care of himself. But he was too dumb even to know he had a joke played on him. I had fun. Made me seem goddamn smart alongside of him. Why, he'd do any damn thing I told him. If I told him to walk over a cliff, over he'd go. That wasn't so damn much fun after a while. He never got mad about it, neither. I've beat the hell out of him, and he could have bust every bone in my body just with his hands, but he never lifted a finger against me." George's voice was taking on the tone of confession. "Tell you what made me stop that. One day a bunch of guys was standing around up on the Sacramento River. I was feeling pretty smart. I turns to Lenny and says, 'Jump in.' And he jumps. Couldn't swim a stroke. He damn near drowned before we could get him. And he was so damn nice to me for pulling him out. Clean forgot I told him to jump in. Well, I ain't done nothing like that no more." "He's a nice fellow," said Slim. "Guy don't need no sense to be a nice fellow. Seems to me sometimes it just works the other way around. Take a real smart guy and he ain't hardly ever a nice fellow." George stacked the scattered cards and began to lay out his solitaire hand. The shoes thudded on the ground outside. At the windows, the light of the evening still made the window squares bright. "I ain't got no people," George said. "I seen the guys that go around on the ranches alone. That ain't no good. They don't have no fun. After a long time, they get mean. They get wanting to fight all the time." "Yeah, they get mean," Slim agreed. "They get so they don't want to talk to nobody. Of course, Lenny's a goddamn nuisance most of the time," said George. "But you get used to going around with a guy and you can't get rid of him." "He ain't mean," said Slim. "I can see Lenny ain't a bit mean. Of course he ain't mean. But he gets in trouble all the time because he's so goddamn dumb. Like what happened in Weed." He stopped. Stopped in the middle of turning over a card. He looked alarmed and peered over at Slim. "You wouldn't tell anybody. What'd he do in Weed?" "You wouldn't tell?" "No, of course you wouldn't." "What'd he do in Weed?" Slim asked again. "Well, he's seen this girl in a red dress. Dumb bastard like he is, he wants to touch everything he likes, just wants to feel it. So he reaches out to feel this red dress, and the girl lets out a squawk. And that gets Lenny all mixed up, and he holds on, because that's the only thing he can think to do. Well, this girl squawks and squawks. I was just a little bit off, and I heard all the yelling, so I comes running, and by that time Lenny's so scared all he can think to do is just hold on. I socked him over the head with a fence picket to make him let go. He was so scared he couldn't let go of that dress, and he's so goddamn strong, you know. Slim's eyes were level and unwinking. He nodded very slowly. So, what happened? George carefully built his line of solitaire cards. Well, that girl rabbits in and tells the law she's been raped. The guys in Weed start a party out to lynch Lenny. So we sit in an irrigation ditch underwater all the rest of that day. Got only our heads sticking out from the side of the ditch. And that night, we scrammed out of there. Slim sat in silence for a moment. Didn't hurt the girl none, huh? He asked finally. Hell no. He just scared her. Well, I'd be scared too if he grabbed me, but he never hurt her. He just wanted to touch that red dress like he wants to pet them pups all the time. He ain't mean, said Slim. I can tell a mean guy a mile off. Of course he ain't. And he'll do any damn thing. Lenny came in through the door. He wore his blue denim coat over his shoulders like a cape, and he walked hunched way over. Hi, Len, said George. How do you like the pup now? Lenny said breathlessly. He's brown and white, just like I wanted. He went directly to his bunk and lay down and turned his face to the wall and drew up his knees. George put down his cards very deliberately. Lenny, he said sharply. Then he twisted his neck and looked over his shoulder. Huh? What you want, George? I told you couldn't bring that pup in here. What pup, George? I ain't got no pup. George went quickly to him, grabbed him by the shoulder and rolled him over. He reached down and picked the tiny puppy from where Lenny had been concealing it against his stomach. Lenny sat up quickly. Give him to me, George. George said, you get right up and take this pup back to the nest. He's got to sleep with his mother. You want to kill him? Just born last night and you take him out of the nest? You take him back or I'll tell Slim not to let you have him. Lenny held out his hands pleadingly. Give 'em to me, George. I'll take 'em back. I didn't mean no harm, George. Honest, I didn't. I just wanted to pet him a little. George handed the pup to him. All right, you get him back there quick, and don't you take him out no more. You'll kill him the first thing you know. Lenny fairly scuttled out of the room. Slim hadn't moved. His calm eyes followed Lenny out the door. Jesus, he said. He's just like a kid, ain't he? Sure, he's just like a kid. There ain't no more harm in him than a kid neither, except he's so strong. I bet he won't come in here to sleep tonight. He'll sleep right alongside that box in the barn. Well, let him. He ain't doing no harm out there. It was almost dark outside now. Old Candy, the swamper, came in and went to his bunk, and behind him struggled his old dog. Hello, Slim. Hello, George. Didn't neither of you play horseshoe? I don't like to play every night, said Slim. Candy went on. Either you guys got a slug of whiskey? I got a gut ache. I ain't, said Slim. I'd drink it myself if I had. And I ain't got a gut ache neither. Got a bad gut ache, said Candy. Them goddamn turnips give it to me. I knowed they was going to before I ever eat 'em. The thick-bodied Carlson came in out of the darkening yard. He walked to the other end of the bunkhouse and turned on the second shaded light. Darker'n hell in here, he said. Jesus, how that nigger can pitch shoes. He's plenty good, said Slim. Damn right he is, said Carlson. He don't give nobody else a chance to win. He stopped and sniffed the air, and still sniffing, looked down at the old dog. God almighty, that dog stinks. Get him out of here, Candy. I don't know nothing that stinks as bad as an old dog. You gotta get him out. Candy rolled to the edge of his bunk. He reached over and patted the ancient dog, and he apologized. Now, I've been around him so much I never notice how he stinks. Well, I can't stand him in here, said Carlson. That stink hangs around even after he's gone. He walked over with his heavy-legged stride and looked down at the dog. Got no teeth, he said. He's all stiff with rheumatism. He ain't no good to you, Candy, and he ain't no good to himself. Why don't you shoot him, Candy? The old man squirmed uncomfortably. Well, hell, I had him so long. Had him since he's a pup. I herded sheep with him, he said proudly. He wouldn't think it to look at him now, but he is the best damn sheepdog I ever seen. George said, I seen a guy in Weed that had an Airedale could herd sheep. Learned it from the other dogs. Carlson wasn't to be put off. Look, Candy, this old dog just suffers itself all the time. If you used to take him out and shoot him right in the back of the head, he leaned over and pointed right there, why, he'd never even know what hit him. Candy looked about unhappily. No, he said softly. No, I couldn't do that. I had him too long. He don't have no fun, Carlson insisted, and he stinks to beat hell. Tell you what, I'll shoot him for you. Then it won't be you that does it. Candy threw his legs off his bunk. He scratched the white stubble whiskers on his cheek nervously. I'm so used to him, he said softly. I had him from a pup. Well, you ain't been kind to him, keeping him alive, said Carlson. Look, Slim's bitch got a litter right now. I bet Slim would give you one of them pups to raise up, wouldn't you, Slim? The Skinner had been studying the old dog with his calm eyes. Yeah, he said, you can have a pup if you want to. He seemed to shake himself free for speech. Carl's right, Candy. That dog ain't no good to himself. I wish somebody'd shoot me if I got old and a cripple. Candy looked helplessly at him, for Slim's opinions were law. Maybe it'd hurt him, he suggested. I don't mind taking care of him. Carlson said, the way I'd shoot him, he wouldn't feel nothing. I'd put the gun right there. He pointed with his toe, right back of the head. It wouldn't even quiver. Candy looked for help from face to face. It was quite dark outside by now. A young laboring man came in. His sloping shoulders were bent forward, and he walked heavily on his heels, as though he carried the invisible grain bag. He went to his bunk and put his hat on a shelf. Then he picked a pulp magazine from his shelf and brought it to the light over the table. Did I show you this, Slim? He asked. Show me what? The young man turned to the back of the magazine, put it down on the table, and pointed with his finger. Right there, read that. Slim bent over it. Go on, said the young man. Read it out loud. Dear Editor, Slim read slowly. I read your mag for 6 years, and I think it is the best on the market. I like stories by Peter Rand. I think he is a wingding. Give us more like The Dark Rider. I don't write many letters. Just thought I would tell you I think your mag is the best dime's worth I ever spent. Slim looked up questioningly. What you want me to read that for? Whit said, Go on. Read the name at the bottom. Slim read, Yours for success, William Tenner. He glanced up at Whit again. What do you want me to read that for? Whit closed the magazine impressively. Don't you remember Bill Tenner? Worked here about 3 months ago? Slim thought. Little guy? He asked. Drove a cultivator? That's him, Whit cried. That's the guy. You think he's the guy who wrote this letter? I know it. Bill and me was in here one day. Bill had one of them books that just come. He was looking in it, and he says, I wrote a letter. Wonder if they put it in the book. But it wasn't there. Bill says, maybe they're saving it for later, and that's just what they done. There it is. Guess you're right, said Slim. Got it right in the book. George held out his hand for the magazine. Let's look at it. Whit found the place again, but he didn't surrender his hold on it. He pointed out the letter with his forefinger, and then he went to his box shelf and laid the magazine carefully in. I wonder if Bill's seen it, he said. Bill and me worked in that patch of field peas. Run cultivated, both of us. Bill was a hell of a nice fellow. During the conversation, Carlson had refused to be drawn in. He continued to look down at the old dog. Candy watched him uneasily. At last, Carlson said, If you want me to, I'll put the old devil out of his misery right now and get it over with. Ain't nothing left for him. Can't eat, can't see, can't even walk without hurting. Candy said hopefully, You ain't got no gun. Hell, I ain't. Got a Luger. Won't hurt him none at all. Candy said, Maybe tomorrow. Let's wait till tomorrow. I don't see no reason for it, said Carlson. He went to his bunk, pulled his bag from underneath it, and took out a Luger pistol. Let's get it over. Still sniffing, looked down at the old dog. Still sniffing, looked down at the old dog. Won't hurt him none at all. Out of his misery right now and get it over with. Ain't nothing left for him. Can't eat, can't see, can't even walk without hurting. Candy said hopefully, you ain't got no gun. Hell, I ain't. Got a Luger. Won't hurt him none at all. Candy said, maybe tomorrow. Let's wait till tomorrow. I don't see no reason for it, said Carlson. He went to his bunk, pulled his bag from underneath it, and took out a Luger pistol. Let's get it over with, he said. We can't sleep with him stinking around in here. He put the pistol in his hip pocket. Candy looked a long time at Slim to try to find some reversal, and Slim gave him none. At last, Candy said softly and hopelessly, all right, take him. He didn't look down at the dog at all. He lay back on his bunk and crossed his arms behind his head and stared at the ceiling. From his pocket, Carlson took a little leather thong. He stooped over and tied it around the old dog's neck. All the men except Candy watched him. Come on, boy. Come on, boy, he said gently. And he said apologetically to Candy, he won't even feel it. Candy didn't move nor answer him. He twitched the thong. Come on, boy. The old dog got slowly and stiffly to his feet and followed the gently pulling leash. Slim said, Carlson? Yeah? You know what to do. What do you mean, Slim? Take a shovel, said Slim shortly. Oh, sure, I get you. He led the dog out into the darkness. George followed to the door and shut the door and set the latch gently in its place. Candy lay rigidly on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Slim said loudly, one of my lead mules got a bad hoof. Got to get some tar on it. His voice trailed off. It was silent outside. Carlson's footsteps died away. The silence came into the room, and the silence lasted. George chuckled. I bet Lenny's right out there in the barn with his pup. He won't want to come in here no more now he's got a pup. Slim said, Candy, you can have any one of them pups you want. Candy didn't answer. The silence fell on the room again. It came out of the night and invaded the room. George said, anybody like to play a little euchre? I'll play out a few with you, said Whit. They took places opposite each other at the table under the light, but George didn't shuffle the cards. He rippled the edge of the deck nervously, and the little snapping noise drew the eyes of all the men in the room so that he stopped doing it. The silence fell on the room again. A minute passed, and another minute. Candy lay still, staring at the ceiling. Slim gazed at him for a moment, then looked down at his hands. He subdued one hand with the other and held it down. There came a little gnawing sound from under the floor, and all the men looked down toward it gratefully. Only Candy continued to stare at the ceiling. "Sounds like there was a rat under there," said George. "We ought to get a trap down there." Whit broke out at the table under the light. "What the hell's taking him so long? Shuffle the cards. Lay out some cards, why don't you?" He rippled the edge of the deck nervously. "We ain't going to get no euchre played this way." Through the eyes of all the men in the room, George brought the card